All right, hey, what's up, y'all? So this is going to be a little bit longer of a video. This is going to be a tutorial, I guess, on how to start a server or create a server for your week 4 projects, right? So it's going to be a little bit longer. There's a lot of stuff we got to cover, but I think that hopefully this will be a good reflection or a good thing you can come back to, so you can kind of get the proper steps to at least get the foundation of what you need to be successful. So the first thing we're going to talk about are some of the tools that you're going to need that are very, very, very helpful in this development process, and things that you just might need in general for your projects. So first of all, if you don't have Git Bash, I highly recommend downloading Git Bash. I use this all the time over a command prompt. This is just essentially a command prompt built to be used with Node, Git, um, everything you can think of. So I think it's very, very useful, and I highly recommend downloading this. All right, the second two tools that we're going to talk about is MySQL and MongoDB. So those are both two different database tools to let you run a database locally on your machine. So for one, MySQL, what you're going to want to do is come to this page, dev.mysql.com/downloads. And there's two things that you will want to get if you want to use a SQL database. And that is one, either the MySQL installer for Windows, download this, and this will install the SQL server onto your computer for your database, or just the MySQL community server. Either works. As far as I can remember, it's been a long time since I've downloaded it, but download one of these two, and you'll be able to use SQL on your machine. And then the second thing with this is that you're going to want to get is MySQL Workbench. Okay, this is kind of like that thing I was showing you in IntelliJ in one of the videos, that I could manage my database from IntelliJ. This is a tool, and as you can see, I literally have it down here on my toolbar because I do use it all the time when I'm not using IntelliJ. So if we open MySQL Workbench, we can connect to our local server, and as you can see, like I have a ton of different databases that I've created, right? So this just allows you to run your queries, see your tables, see. I don't know if it lets you. Yeah, I don't know if it's going to create a wireframe for you showing you how it works, but it allows you to do anything you want with your databases in here. Right? It's just a tool to manage your databases. This is also a decent one. Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. I like that one as well, especially if you're working with Azure. But anyways, we'll move on. The one that Nelly had me use, which is also a very great database system, is MongoDB. So you're going to want to come over to this page, right? And it'll tell you install MongoDB Community Edition. That's what you want. That's the free one. This will install a Mongo server on your computer. Follow the instructions. I recommend running it as a service. So like if you open this, your task manager, you can see that, let me see here, let's go by name, and you should be able to see that Mongo, right, database server. So that's always running on my machine. MySQL is always running on my machine because I have both of them. So anytime I fire up my PC and I want to run, any of these IDEs that we're using, IntelliJ, Visual Studio, and I want to connect to a database, it's already open, it's already running, and I can do that. I'll drop these links in the description of the video. Another thing you're going to need is Node, right? If you don't have Node yet. So it's very simple. Just download Node. It's going to download it. I'm not going to run this because I've already done this. I have Node. I'm not using the most up-to-date version, but when you do this, I would recommend that you use the long-term support edition. Right there, the current tends to be unstable, and a lot of these tools and places that you will deploy your sites to might not support the most current edition, and you'll run into a lot of errors and a lot of head-throbbing bugs that way. So run the long-term support. We can check, and again, cool feature of Bash is we can just say git bash here, and you can do this in any folder, and it'll open you directly in your folder. So if we type in node-v, it'll tell you your version. This is how you'll know you have Node installed on your machine properly. Great. So we'll come back. And then the last one that I highly recommend is Postman. If you've watched any of my other videos, what Postman does is allow you to check your APIs, your server. So not just third-party APIs, but when you build a server, that's what it is, right? It's an API, right? You're making RESTful calls to your server. And we can check all of that, like I have in one of my previous videos, through Postman, right? As you can see, I use it just a little bit. No, this is a super useful tool, right? You can create folders for different projects you're working on. And you can make requests, right, to your different applications. So super useful tool. I highly recommend creating an account. It's free. You can download the desktop application like I have. I pin it to my taskbar. Super useful and highly recommended. Okay, so now let's go ahead and see, where did I have that? So now let's go ahead and get started creating a project. So what we're going to want to do is go ahead and whoever wants to do this, when you get to your projects, somewhere on your computer, I have something called Visual Studio where I keep a lot of my Visual Studio projects. I have web apps where I store my massive web applications. Whatever you want to do, doesn't matter. Kind of like my React video. Just new folder, group. Oh shit, let's say group project. Awesome. Now let's open that up and let's go open with VS Code. Great. So that popped open. Okay, so now we have a empty VS Code project. So how do we turn this into a Node project? Well, for one, we can type npm. So Node, anything you're doing in Node, you want to type npm. So npm init. So what is this going to do? Well, this is going to initialize this into an empty Node project, right? It's kind of like React, like anything. So npm init. I'm not going to name this anything, just use a version. We can add all of this later in index.js. We will change that. Skip through. Is this okay? Yes, it is. Okay. So package JSON, that's what this is, right? This entry point for us is going to be server.js. Okay. Because with server, and let me double check that I'm not being crazy. Yeah. So server.js. Now, if you were running a multi-level project, so for example, I create a folder called client. This is where the HTML is going to go. And then I create another folder called server. Okay. Be cognizant that in this package JSON, if the top level is your entry point, it's going to be server and then server.js. In this instance, we're not doing that. In this instance, we're going to run it all from the top level. So first thing we're going to do is create a new file, and we're going to call it server.js. Okay. This is the starting point of our application, right? This is what is going to open and create that API and that routing and handle all those different things that we want this to handle. So let me check this out. Okay, so we're back on the web. So we have our server.js file, but we can't do anything with it yet. So don't worry about signing up. I'm not even signed up. So I think in one of my previous videos, what I was talking about is that there's this cool thing called Node, npm, and on it is a plethora of packages and tools and things created by other people. So one thing that we're going to be using for our projects is called Express, right? If you want to create a server that runs in JavaScript, there's this tool that we need called Express, right? Open framework, minimalist, blah, 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 blah. Yep, so this is Express, right? And if we come to Node and we want to use Express and you want to know how to use it, here's how you use it, right? You got to come to npm and read the documentation. Sometimes they'll have GitHub repositories attached to this, and that'll have even more documentation. But yeah, this is how you're going to want to do that. So we want to use Express, right? We know that we need Express to run our server. So how do you install it? Well, too easy. They always give it to you, and they have a little button that says copy to my clipboard. Good deal. So now, if we come back, right, at the root layer where our package JSON is, right now, if the server was in a different folder, we would want to have a different package JSON for just this server. But however, we want to run that here. So what are we going to do? We're going to say npm iExpress, and that's going to go ahead and install. It's done. Quick and easy, right? So if we come back and we look at how to run an Express server, well, it says constant express equals express. So this is how you import a module from a Node package. There's two different ways to do this, right? Now, I'm sure if you've watched me doing the React or the React Native, you'll see that I'm using an import statement. An import statement is a little bit different than require. So we're not building a React application that's built strictly on ES6 syntax, okay? What we're building is called CommonJS. So there's two different types of modules. There's CommonJS modules and there's ES6 modules. To import a CommonJS module, so what we're building, we're going to use this annotation called require. So I know that I need this to get my application running or started. So we're gonna come back here and we're gonna say const. Well, I don't even need to copy paste this. No worries. Constant express equals require, right? Express. It knows. Okay. Cool. What was the next step? It said constant. We need to create a function, a variable that's going to be a function that says constant app equals express, what we just said it was. And that's all in our documentation, and we can see that here, right? No worries. Awesome. And simple, right? So this is a simple get route, right? So when you go on the web and you say www.npmjs.com/packages/express, that's a get route, right? That's all inside of this. And that's telling this website to return this whole web page that you see, right? That's a get request. So we're just going to create a simple get request, right? We'll copy it, a get, and we will say app.get, right? So we said app is express. It's an express server. App.get, this is our first route. Function, request. So the request coming in, and then the response that we want to give. So we have two options of what we can do with this request or this response. In this instance, we're not taking anything from this in a request, right? Our client at this point is not sending us anything. That's the request. There's no data coming in for this. We don't need to do anything, but we still need to declare rec and res, right? This is just part of express. Res. So res.send, hello world. Okay. So now we have a route, right? Very simple modular route. And what we want to do is say app.listen. So we need to get this app somehow. And this is very basic on the port. I'm gonna show you how to go a little bit deeper into the porting. Okay. So when you want to go a little bit deeper into the porting, we can give it a specific port. And this is what I always use in my applications. And we'll give this over here. So it's a constant port because process.env. Env is something that we're going to want. Or we can tell it what port we want it to listen to, right? So if I didn't want the world knowing what port I was using, I could store that in an environment variable, and we will talk about those a little bit later. But in this instance, we're going to say, if we're not using the process.env, we're going to use port 3001. Now, how do I know that my app is open and running? Well, I'm not going to use the app.listen because that's too simple. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn this into an asynchronous function expression, and we're going to say console.log, app.listen on our port, right? So this is how, if we want to talk to it from our client or whatever reason, use this port, and we're going to say console.log and that anonymous function expression, now listening on our port. So now we know when we start this that we're going to be listening on that port, and we know that our application is running. Too easy. Okay, so now we need to figure out how to get the server running, right? So we have server, we have it returning a route, but how do we get this to fire up? Well, it all comes from package JSON scripts. What does this script do in our package JSON? This is the commands that tell us how we are going to run this application. Well, being that our package JSON and our server are in the same folder, right, the group project, same level, we don't have to do a whole lot. So first, we're going to come in here and we're going to say start. So what happens is we're going to want to start our server. So when I say npm start, as you guys have probably seen me do in a few of my videos, this is how we're going to do it. And we're going to say server.js. So we're just going to run the server, right? So in quotes, start. This is JSON format, quoting, add a colon, server.js. Now, what happens is when you're developing, you run into these issues where it's like, well, shoot, I made a change to my server, and now I got to stop the server, start the server, stop the server, start the server. Well, there's a package and a tool that helps you get around that, and it's called NodeMon. So you can come and read this documentation if you want to, but NodeMon, essentially what it does is that every time you start typing in your server, in your backend JS, it is going to restart your server. So every time that you make a change, we don't got to worry about it. If you have an error when you're typing, don't worry, it'll go away eventually. But this is a super useful tool, so it prevents a lot of lost time by stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, stop, start every time you make a change. So again, we can just copy this to our clipboard, and then we can come back into our terminal here. This is a bash terminal. You can see Control V, npm I NodeMon. So we're going to install NodeMon. And notice this list of dependencies, right? This is just telling you all the things you have installed, and it's telling you the version of what you have installed. Great deal. So now another tool or way that I do this is called watch. So we're gonna have to say npm run watch, npm run test, and the only one we don't say run is start. You probably could. It's been a while since I've done this, but I don't know. So we have NodeMon installed, and if you want to go read that NodeMon documentation, feel free. I'm not going to explain it completely on how this works, but I can tell you this is how we're gonna do it. We're gonna say NodeMon server.js. So now that we have NodeMon, our server, and Express installed, so we're saying constant express equals require express. We're importing the express module that we downloaded from npm, right? It's in here. So if we look somewhere, express, right? So we installed this, and this is just somebody else's, right? Lib. I don't know if you remember lib from Java. Same concept, right? This is just a package somebody else created. So we have this node module. We just need to import it to use it. Kind of the same as Java. It's all just different syntax. And then we're saying app equals express. Start the express server. Port. What port do we want to use? We want to use 3001. We created a simple route to ensure that we can check our server's working. It's just going to return a string. There's much more we can do with this, and we'll get into that. And then we're just going to tell it to open up and listen on our port. Cool. So we got that started. Remember, so now we have our scripts. We have npm run watch. So we're going to say npm run watch, and hopefully this opens first go. And it does, right? So NodeMon. So we can see that NodeMon opened. To restart the server at any time, type rs, or it'll just do it. So for example, if we come to server and I copy and let's just say paste this new route, a get route, we should see NodeMon restarted it for us. So we don't have to come in here and do this every time, and we can go see those changes actively happening. And we can say this route equals home, and in this route, see it's restarting. This would be the home page. Great. Awesome. So now let's go and check out how this works. So we have the server running, right? And we want to make sure that this works. Well, there's two ways to do this. We can do HTTPS or HTTP / localhost. And remember, we said port. This is the colon, port 3001. Enter. Uh-oh. That's because it's not HTTPS. It's going to be HTTP. There we go. Hello world. So we've seen that worked, right? So our routing, remember that we had routing. So we said get, and this is going to be localhost because this is running on my local machine on port 3001. And we want to return this string for the first page. Now we have the second route /home, so we can see how the routing works. And we can go here and say now /home. Ho, not home, not ho. Boom, right? So see the routing, we created that route, that /home, and this would be the home page. So that's exactly how the routing works, if that makes sense for anybody. Awesome. So we're gonna take 5 and we're gonna come back and let's talk a little bit about Mongo. Okay, so welcome back. So I said we're going to talk about Mongo. We are in a second. I wanted to show you the usefulness of Postman really quick. So there's this cool thing. So you can say new collection, blank collection inside your Postman. And if we come in here, click these 3 dots, and we're going to say we could add a folder. We call it home routes if we wanted to, whatever it's called. We could rename this collection. We could say group project because it's going to be for our group project. So we know it's our group project. And then we'll come in this folder and we'll say add a request. And then we'll just call this home. We'll say home, right? And in here we could say HTTP, right? Our actual route, localhost 3001 /home, right? This is a GET request. Now, mind you, the routing is important. So if we say post, put, patch, delete, right? We want to ensure that we are calling the right method. So if you remember in our application, we said app.get, that's a GET. If we were going to be sending data, we'd say app.post, right? But in this case, it's a GET request because the user is getting data, right? So now if we come to this, we have our GET route and we say send. There we go, right? So this is how we can test this without ever touching our browser, without ever checking anything. If we wanted to check a user's data, we could say /user /login, whatever the route was, and we could ensure that the user was properly logging in. So just a super useful tool. I use it all the time. You can make a third-party API call and check your data being returned. Great tool. I highly recommend it. There's also another one, I believe it's called Insomnia. Insomnia is kind of cool. It allows you to import a bunch of requests sometimes when you're building an application. You can create essentially a JSON file with different requests. I don't get that advanced with it. I write my requests as I need them, but I do think this is a super cool and useful tool. All right, so one thing that we need to talk about too before we use Mongo is using MongoDB Compass. Okay, so MongoDB Compass is essentially like that MySQL workbench. It is something you're going to need to connect to your MongoDB server. So when I come in here, I can create new connections or new servers or however I'm going to do it. And this will give me the URI so long as my Mongo server is running. And this will allow me to connect, right? This is the connection string. We need connection strings to talk to databases and Yeah, I mean, really, that's your connection string. That's how we connect to it, right? And we can say localhost, whatever our Mongo port is going to be. And in this case, my Mongo port has always been 27017. So, right, so that's your connection. We can say edit, we can say not edit, we can add authentication to it. Don't worry about that. That's what your backend will be for, creating different security layers. We're not going to do that through Mongo. However, we can if we wanted to, but we're not going to do that here. So anyways, download Compass. It's essentially like Workbench. You're going to need it. All right, now let's go check back on our code. So for our code, right, and see, I told you you'll get errors as you're doing this. So for our code, so to connect to a database through our code, well, for one, there's a couple things we're going to do. We're going to need to update our server. So think about, for example, what happens when you want to, I don't know, sign a user in. Well, how do you send that data? Well, if you've looked at any type of post request, maybe through a third-party API, one of the things that you do is you send it through JSON format. So you'll say this thing in your JavaScript called JSON.stringify or JSON.parse. So what we're doing is we're using that JavaScript object notation to format our data being sent. So how do we do that with an Express server? Well, we have to use this tool, and tell our app that it's going to be using JSON. So we're going to say app.use. You see it pops right up, app.use. And then we're going to say, in this instance, express.json. Oh, yeah, Nelly. Express.use JSON. So we know that our application is using JSON. Express.use JSON returns middleware, only parses JSON. So if you're ever confused about what any of this does, you can read it 90% of the time. I'll say Visual Studio will tell you why you're doing it. We will have middleware at some point. I think in one of my previous videos, I talked about using app.use express.url encoded. You may want to add that because at some point you are going to be using middleware. And I already have this. So app.use express.url encoded returns that parses URL encoded bodies. So yes, you may or may not need that. Okay, so we want to connect to our Mongo server. So one of the things that we're going to want to do is what I do is I create this folder and I call it, what the fuck? Oh, something happened there. All right, my bad. We're back. So we were talking about building a MongoDB connection. So we talked about MongoDB Compass. We talked about downloading MongoDB. I would not recommend SQL for anybody that wants to build a server for the project. SQL requires a lot more knowledge and in-depth, and the querying languages are a language in themselves. So if you want to, I'd recommend going and check that out. But anyways, let's get back to the Mongo. So we mentioned that we can send JSON, right? Especially if you want to have users. So the first thing that I do is I create this folder called connection. Okay, and inside this connection folder, we're going to have something really simple. It's going to be a connection.js file. Okay. So now we're almost ready to connect to Mongo. However, we can't do it yet, right? We don't have the necessary tools. So we can hit Control C, shut down our server. Excuse me. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to install Mongo. So if we come back to where is it? If we come back over here and we come to Node, we can look at Mongo. So how would we add MongoDB to our project? Well, too easy. So first of all, if you come over to npm and look at MongoDB, they have all the documentation you would need for it, for the most part, right? And they tell you how to install it, npm install MongoDB. And something else that they might not tell you, and I'm trying to see if they're going to show you how to do it, and they're not, is Mongoose. So Mongoose is just another package that allows you to create that connection and create these different things within Mongo. And we can take a look at that in a minute. But what we want to do is Control V. Oh, no, that didn't do it. That's okay. So we're just going to type npm I. We've seen what it was. MongoDB. And be careful how you spell this, right? Because you might install some off-the-wall package that's not going to do what you expected it to do. Great. If we look at our package JSON, you can see that we have MongoDB. Let's take a look at Mongoose. So we have Mongoose. So we come over to our npm package manager and we can see what Mongoose does, right? So installation Node.js, MongoDB. Then, so it even tells you need to install MongoDB, and then you need to install Mongoose, excuse me. So Mongoose it tells exactly what to do, right? Documentation. And right here, so this is how we are going to do it. We're going to say mongoose.connect, right? So this is how we're going to connect to our MongoDB server. And as you can see in some of my old projects, this is exactly how I connected. I used the 127.0.0.1. That is the, what the heck do we call it? The IP address, not the actual localhost. Same, but different. But anyways, right? So, but we need to install Mongoose. So we're going to come back over and we're going to say npm I mongoose. And we should see it pop up in here in a second. Great, and we have Mongoose installed. So now for the connection.js. So this is exactly how I do it. So remember we looked at it and it says const mongoose equals require mongoose. So we can literally just copy paste this. I've said this a million times. I'll keep saying I am a copy paste developer. Okay, now how do we connect to it? Well, it said, what did it say here? It said mongoose, since we declared mongoose.connect MongoDB, right? So really what we can do is this. So we could just say, all right, mongoose, it goes mongoose.connect. And whatever you, mind you, whatever you say here, oh, good Lord, my recording is actually going to end here because I'm at my limit. No big deal. So whatever you say here, this is going to be the name of your database, right? So if I want to say group project, that's what it would be named, right? So this is how you would name it. So, group proj. That's it. And then, okay, we're back. Bear with me. This is gonna be a really long video. I'm gonna try to section it off when I upload this to YouTube, so you can skip to different points. I was kind of looking at some of the other stuff I did, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna end up taking this. I'm gonna show you how to create a full, complete user login and sign up. At least on the back end, you'll have to figure out how to do it on your front end using your fetch requests. But what we'll do is we'll figure out how to return a JSON web token, and you can use this to determine whether a user is logged in or not. So by the end of this, you'll be able to create a user login and sign up and have this stored in MongoDB. So anyways, we left off on this mongoose.connect. However, we're not quite done with this. What we need to do yet is we need to create or export, this connection, right? Because we have this connection, but we're not doing anything with it yet. So we need to say module.exports, and then we're going to say that's going to be equal to mongoose.connection. And one of the cool things that I think is that this will tell you exactly what it does. The Mongoose module's default connection equivalent to mongoose.connections. And if we looked at on the node packages, I believe, let me go to node, and if we go back to, I want to say, let me see here. If we looked at MongoDB, we could see, if it'll load, we could see that it was talking about those connections, I believe. And maybe I'm just losing my mind. Somewhere in here. Yeah, so it's just a fancier way to connect to MongoDB. Mongoose. I thought they said something about it, but they really handle it all for you, which is why I really enjoy these packages and these things that are created for me. So now what we need to do is that we need to go back to our server.js, and we need to figure out how in here, when we run this server, do we connect to MongoDB. So what we're going to want to do at this point is we're going to need another import, and we're going to want to say const db for database equals require, right? And this doesn't have to be a node module to require things. And let's see here, and we can say connection, and then we can say connection. Our connection, if you want to, just help you remember, you can say .js, doesn't matter, you can have it or not. But now we have direct access to that connection. So, and it even tells you, right, because we're connecting the Mongoose's default connection, and so it knows that we're trying to connect to a Mongo database. So what we can do is before we even get to the app and we open the app, we can do something with this connection. So we can do a couple things here. db.on, and here, there's a couple things we can do. It's an event listener. We can say on error, right? So there might be an error, and we need to know what that error is. We can say error, arrow function, and we can say console.error, and this will produce a error in the console, and we just want to show that error. Excuse me. So we have something to show us that on an error, we want to know what the error is, so it can help us troubleshoot and fix our bugs. And then we want to do something else. We want to say db.once, right? And we can look at what that does. It's an event mirror that once that server, we're not calling it server, we're calling it db. But once it's connected, right, we can say what we want it to do. So db.once, and what I say is open. And on this open, we can make this equivalent to an arrow function. Once it's open, and there's a couple ways you can do this. We can say console.log. So this is just one way to do it. You don't have to do it in the braces here. You can just do it inline, console.log. Successfully, I don't even know if that's the right way to spell that. My English is terrible. Successfully connected to our MongoDB or our database. There we go. So once it's open, it'll let us know, like, hey, yep, you're good job, dude. You're connected to your database, which is great, right? This is all we want. So that is exactly how we are going to connect to our Mongo database. And we can now say npm run watch, and we can see if this works. And let's just double check here before we launch this. Our MongoDB connection string, like it told us to do in the documentation, we have MongoDB installed, the server's running, and we have our compass. So this theoretically should be how we connect. So let's run it, npm run watch, and let's see it happen in action. Successfully connected to our database. Awesome. See, it works. So now we're connected to our database. There's these other things that we can do to check our Mongo database, and I can show you that here in a second. Okay, so how do we check our Mongo database? Well, there's a couple ways we can do this. One, we can open a new bash terminal, and Mongo has a CLI, so a command line interface. So we can say Mongo. Great, and now we're connected to the Mongo shell. I don't know if you guys remember J shell. Same, but different, right? And now what we can do is we say show DBs. And look, so I am connected to my Mongo, and my Mongo has a bunch of random databases, and I don't see. Let me see if I don't know. It doesn't look like we created our new database, but that's okay. Because we really haven't configured anything to be created, right? So I don't see group proj unless I'm just going crazy. But anyways, if you, let's just say, like for example, the one that I created for Nelly, we can say use Nelly's challenge, right? And now we can say show collections. So we have two different tables, and we're going to talk about how to create tables. So we have destinations and users. That's okay. So Control C, exit, does buy. Good. We don't need it no more. This is one way you can double check what you're doing. Okay, so now we need to look at how are we going to create these routes that we need to interact with our Mongo database. Well, before we can even interact with it, we're probably going to want to create a folder, and what I call these in any, it doesn't matter if it's Java, JavaScript, C#. A model is a structure in which you are going to store data in your database. So no matter what I'm using, I use something called models. So we're going to say models, and in this, we're going to want to create some MongoDB schemas. right? So I told you I'd show you how to create a user login and sign up. So inside of here, we are going to want to say user.js. If you were using SQL, this would be user.schema. But Mongo doesn't use a quote schema, so we're not going to worry about that. So the first thing that we're going to want to do at the top of creating a schema is we're going to want to import Mongoose, because we're going to be using Mongoose, and then we're going to want to say const, and I just do this for ease of use, schema equals a mongoose dot, it should have schema. There we go, mongoose dot schema. All right, so rather than having to say mongoose dot schema for everything, it just makes it a little bit easier. We can simplify it to schema. No big deal. So now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to say const user schema or const user even. I just say schema because there might be a lot of other instances where you're using a variable called schema, or not schema, user, and then we'll just say equals new schema, and we can open that up into a function, and then we're going to drop it down into an object, and this is how we are going to declare what our schema looks like, what our data is going to be structured like inside of that database. So for example here, and there's much more you can do with this, we're going to keep it very simple. So we need to say that there's going to be a username and that it's going to be a string. You can objectify this and you can add so much more, but for time's sake and complexity sake, we'll just keep it simple. And we'll say email, and we can say that's going to be a string, and we can just say password, and that is also going to be a string. There we go. So we just created our first schema. We can link different tables. I'm not going to show how to do that in this video, but there you 100% definitely can do that. Another thing we can do here is that Mongo, unlike Java, in Spring you have to tell it to auto create IDs. MongoDB will automatically do it. So if we did not want to have it auto create IDs for us, we could say false. ID false. However, I highly recommend leaving the ID in place because it is one way that you can easily update or delete or do anything with a user or almost any table for that matter. Leave the ID in place. It's very, very useful, and it's auto-generating, so we don't need to worry about telling it to increment or do anything. It'll just do it. Great. So now that we have this schema created, we can end this here, and we can say module.exports, and we can say that is equal to mongoose.model, because it's a model, right? So now it knows it's a model, and we're going to call this model. This is where we name it. We're going to say this is going to be the user table. This is what the table is called, and then we're going to say it's going to be the user schema. That is what our model is going to be, this object, which is a schema. Great. So now we're exporting that. Awesome pasta. Great. Well, now we need to figure out how we're going to do something with this user model. So how are we going to do that? Well, okay. So how we're going to do this is we first need to think about how we're going to handle this routing. All right. We have the model. We have this route, but we need to do something with the model and a route. Well, this route alone here, we don't really want to build this out. We don't want to build this out in the actual server, right? Because if we built a lot of routes, the server file could get really, really, really long. So I like to keep my applications a little bit more modular. Well, now we start turning into something what's called the MVC pattern, the model view controller. Well, we have a model, right? We need to do something with the model, but we need to create something called the controller, right? So what I like to do is I like to create this folder called controller, and inside of this controller, inside this controller, we can create a folder, and we can just call this API because it's going to be an API connection. And that's kind of ugly, and I don't really like that there. So what we're going to do is create another folder, and we say other routes. All right, we might not use it yet. We might not ever use it. That's okay. And then inside of here, we're going to need to create a file called index.js. And what this file is going to do is this file is going to take a collection of all of our routes, right? We're going to pile them all up into one file. So inside of this file, you know what? No, I'm sorry. I'm jumping a little bit ahead of the game here. We don't really want to do that yet. All right. So let's just go with the API. So API, this is where we're going to create the route to do something with our login. So or with our login, we will create a login with that model. So we need to do something with that model. We're going to do it in this route called API. So let's create a new file. Let's call it auth because it's authentication. Login and sign up is an authentication. Auth.js. So inside of this, we need to know that this is a route. Well, how do we know it's a route? Well, we can do something, say const router. It's going to be a router equals require. And we can say that's going to be express. And then we're going to say express has an extension. Express has an extension dot router. Look, it knows what we want to do. This is going to be a route. We're routing our application. Cool beans. Well, we know that we need to use our model, so we might need to import something else. And we're going to say const user, because it's the user table, equals require. And that's going to be our path to our models, and it's going to be user because it's the user model. And again, if you want to say .js to help you remember, that's okay. I do it sometimes. Now we need to think a little bit. Well, we need to create a user. Well, there's a couple things that you need when creating a user. Well, there's a couple things that we want to do when there is a login or a sign up. There's a couple. So first of all, when signing up, we don't want to just store a user's password in there as, if Jimmy said his password was Jimmy123, we're not going to save it into our databases Jimmy123. We need to do something called hashing. We need to hash the password, which makes it incredibly difficult for attackers to get someone's username or login, right? Like if it's just transmitting back and forth to Jimmy, and they got somehow access to my data or my information, by hashing, they wouldn't have access. They still wouldn't know because it'd be this long string of craziness that no one would understand how to read, right? Because it goes through this hashing. And, I'm sure there's somewhere out there that somebody knows how to do it, but we're still going to do it anyways because it's the safer approach to creating passwords. So how are we going to do that? Well, we stop our server. We're going to use this tool called bcrypt. So we're going to say npmi bcrypt. And we're going to go ahead and install that. So we should see it pop up in our database, and it sure is. Great. So we got that inside of our DB, our package JSON. Awesome. So now we can use bcrypt. So how do we import bcrypt? Well, we can say const bcrypt equals require, and that should just be bcrypt. And it knows that we're going to use bcrypt, and we'll show you how to use that in a minute. There's something else that we need. Well, how on our client, on your guys' HTML web pages, do we know if a user's logged in? Well, we can send something back to them called a JSON web token. And through that JSON web token, we can store that into local storage. We can store it inside of a cookie, however you want to do it. I personally send it in the cookies, and there's great NPM libraries to check your cookies and make sure your token exists. Cookies are much more secure than local storage. I can create another video on how to use cookies if you guys would like to see that. But all we need to do here in the backend is just send that token back. So we need to install a library called, what the heck is it called? JSON web token. And I think there's multiple packages you can use to handle JSON web tokens. But in this instance, we're just going to install just the JSON web token library. So npm I JSON web token. And we're installing that, and great. So that's installed now. So now what we need to do also is import that JSON web token library that we just installed. And remember that these are all just packages that are being installed into our node modules we have direct access to. So now we're going to say const JWT JSON web token equals require JSON web token. Boom, awesome, we have it. So now we have the ability to create a user through our model. We have bcrypt, which is our ability to hash a user password, and we'll show how that works. And then we also have our JSON web token. So once a user is signed in or logged in, we can create a JSON web token and send it back to them. Awesome. So now we have a router, we have a user, we have bcrypt, we have JSON. So now we need to do something with that. So now we need to create a route inside of our controller. A controller is just a method or technique for routing. So now we're going to want to say router. This is going to be a sign up. It's going to be a post, right? We're posting. The user on the front end is sending data to the backend. That's a post. So router.post. And then we're going to want to say what the route name is. And in this instance, it's going to be sign up. We need to do something with this. Well, we know it's going to be asynchronous, async, right? Because we need to do something before we actually continue. Async, our function, rec-res. Remember, it's a route, rec-res, request response. We're going to need to do something with the rec in this instance, right? And then we're just going to turn that into an arrow function and an object. Great. So now we have a sign up route. It's an asynchronous function that has a request and a response. Well, in this instance, we know that when we're transmitting this data, this user information for a sign up, it's going to be coming over the body. And we can do a whole nother video on how to send the body over a fetch. I think actually I'm looking over, Nelly's doing it right now. So you should know how to send data over the body of a fetch request. Great. So now we know that that's there. So how do we access the body of the request? Well, we know that when creating a user, there's a couple things that we need. And we know that's going to be the username because we created that in the model. We know that we're going to need the email, and we know that we're going to need the password. And we know now that we have a request. So let's do something with our request. We can say request.body. Look, it knows what you want to do. Request.body. Awesome. So now we have access to these three things, right? We have access to these three things. So now we might want to wrap this in a try catch. Try catch. And we can say catch. And we can say error. And we might want to do something with this error. So for now, we're just going to say console.error. Console.error. Oh man, I forgot how to do this. Error signing user up. And then we also might want to log what that actual error is. There we go. Perfect. So we know that there's an error. It'll print this message, error signing user up, and it'll tell us what the actual error is. Now in this try, right, there's a couple things we want to do. Well, do we want to let a user, think about this, do we want to let a user create an account with the same email and maybe a different password? Well, we could see how that might be conflicting to our database. So if I have a database and we're checking when we're signing a user, and if the email and the password match, well, what if they have two of the same email? Well, we don't want to let a user sign up with two of the same things. So in this instance, we can say const existing user equals await. And remember that we imported the user from the model. So this is how we are now going to talk to our database. User dot, and so we have all these pre-built in cool features that MongoDB offers. Find by ID. Remember I told you, find by ID would be great. So, in an instance where we're logging a user in or we're getting user data, we could just find the user by ID opposed to username, because what if, users have the same usernames? Well, we might want to allow them to have same usernames, not the same email or the same ID. So we can find by ID, we can find by whatever we want. In this case, we're going to say find one, and we need to break that object, and we want to find it by the email. So if they're signing up, we want to make sure that this email doesn't exist. And now what we can say, if existing user is true, if we found one, we want to return, which this will break our statement, return res, and we're going to say dot status, right? HTTP statuses. We're going to say 400. Gosh, I cannot remember, 400 unauthorized or already exist or something like that. I'd have to look up my statuses. 400, so no, this isn't happening. And we can say here, we want to return a message, right? Message. And in that message, we can say user already has an account. And I think that's it. Yeah, no, I'm right. That's it. So res.status 400, like, nope, this ain't happening. Our JSON. So mind you, remember how we're sending this back. If we're sending it in JSON format, when you retrieve this response from your fetch request, you might want to say something along the lines of await response.json, because that response.json is how you're going to parse this message to display to your user. Great. So we did that. Now we want to handle the instance where we are going to sign a user up. So if this doesn't happen and that user doesn't exist yet, we now need to create the user. So the first thing I want to think about is, well, we need to store this to the database. Well, we were talking about we needed to hash a password before we stored this to the database. So how are we going to hash a password? Well, we're going to say const hashed password equals await bcrypt. We imported that bcrypt dot hash the password, and we're going to say password, and then we're going to say salt rounds. And in this instance, we don't have a salt round. So we probably want to come up to the top, create a global variable and say const salt rounds equals 10. I am not an expert on this. The, the salt rounds has to do with how many times we're going to loop through and create crazy weird numbers and letters for this password. And the more salt rounds, obviously, the more secure. I would recommend if you're curious about this, going and looking up what salt rounds is. I'm not an expert. I just know that it has to do with how many times it's going to change your information. So that's going to be important to remember. Awesome. So we now have a hash password, and this is how we're going to save that hash password to the database, because we're not going to save Jimmy123 as a password to that database. So now we can say const new user equals new user, our user schema that we imported, and it's going to be username, email, and the hashed or password. However, that password is going to be, in this instance, the hashed password, because we're not saving the password as the actual password. Great. Awesome. And now we want to say await, because this is asynchronous. We're still awaiting. So we waited to salt the password. We created a new user. Now we're going to await new user dot save. Right? We have all these methods from our MongoDB, our mongoose. We're going to say save. So we're going to save it to the database. And if that was successful, we can do a console log here to let ourselves know, console.log user. Let me say new user was created. Great. So that new user was just created. Awesome. And now we want to return a response to the front end to let them know that this was successful. So we can say return our response dot status, and we're going to say 200, meaning it was good, dot JSON. And in this instance, we want to return a message saying it was successful, not that it failed. So message, and we can say user was registered successfully. That's probably not how you spell that. Whatever. Again, I told you English sucks. Great. So they were registered successfully, and we're not going to sign them in quite yet. And in this instance, if there was an internal error, we're going to want to return a res.status of 500 meaning internal server error .json. And we want to say our message in this instance was there was an internal server error. And depending on what you're creating, we can say if the problem persists, please contact support, or something similar, something along those lines. It reminds you as a backend developer, it's kind of nice for you to incorporate these, like you can make the front end developers have to write their own custom message, but it's just easier if we can tell them what we want it to say because we know what's going on in the backend. Awesome. So now we have a sign up route. Now all that's left to do is test the sign up route. We need to make sure. Actually, I'm sorry, no, I skipped way ahead. Holy smokes. So no, that's not that stuff. We do need to test this. However, we want to say module.exports, because we're not even using this yet. Module.exports equals router. We want to export this router. And now remember how I said on this index.js, we're rounding up all of our we're rounding up all of our routes in total. So now we need to somehow import this. Well, the first thing we want to do is say const router again here equals require express. And remember, we want to say dot router because it's still a route. It's still a route dot router. And then we're going to want to say create a variable saying const let's say API, constant API routes. Let's say equals require, and then let's go ahead and require our API /auth. And we can say .js to remember that it's a JavaScript file. Great. And now we can say this router needs to use, and let's give it a route /API. So now think about going down. So if this was going to require the API /API routes, right? Now we know that it's going to be our website /API / come to our auth /sign up. So API. Or in another instance of even better scenario, what we could probably do is come back to our index and we could say auth, because we know it's an authentication route, and we can say auth /sign up. Now we could just say module.export equals router. Great. So now how do we use this? Well, now we need to use this in the server.js. So this is the index of the controller. So how do we get this index? Well, we can come over here and we can say const routes, the routes, because there's going to be multiple routes, equals require, and we can say / inside parentheses controllers, or controller in this instance. And now, rather than using these random gets, we can tell our app to just use our routes. So here we can say app.use routes. And now it knows to use all of our routes because we told it express equaled express.router. So we know that it's routing and to use these different routes. Great. So now all that's left is to go and test. And of course, make sure that we fire up our server, npm run watch, just make sure we have no issues. Nope, we don't. Fired it up, connected to our database. Great. And maybe we can even go back and see if our database was created. And let's see, show DBs. And yeah, look at that. Group proj was created. So great. We got our group project created. We actually had a schema. It did what we wanted it to do. Awesome. So now all we need to do is go ahead and go and test. Okay, so now we're back over to Postman. We need to test our routes. This is how I was telling you we could test creating a user, a login, and a sign up without ever even creating a front end. So for those of you that want to work on the back end or want to try to tackle something like this, we can go ahead and do that. And this is supposed to be a get. So what we can do here is we can add a request, and we can call this request sign up. Sign up. And we can say HTTP versus localhost. We can just do this auth sign up. Look at that, because I've already done this before in many other apps. Awesome. And this is going to be a post request. And to send data to this through Postman, how we would send this through a front end, we can go over and do something called the body, because remember rec.body, and we say raw, because it's raw, and then we're going to say that it's going to be in JSON format. So now we can open up a JSON object, and we can say the first parameter that we need was the username, and that's going to be, I don't know, let's just say Tyler, and comma, and then we can say our email is going to be tyler@email.com. And then we can, oh man, okay, this is gonna be a long video. I'm sorry, bear with me. If you stick with it though, you will be able to create a user login, sign up, and Express server for your website. So just bear with me. Let's get back to it. So we got left off at password. So we're gonna want to say password, and then we can set that to, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you might want to add requirements to this, and you can always do that later on. Great. So we are sending this in JSON format over the body, how we wanted to send it on our backend. And let's go and send that request. And bam, look at that. So our MongoDB server said, yep, good job. We created a new user. Now we need to check for that edge case real quick, right? We said that in our server.js on the auth, we said that if the existing user was there, we wanted to tell them that user already has an account. So let's go ahead and check that right now and see if it'll let me send this again. And it shouldn't, theoretically. Hope not. And it doesn't. Great. Perfect. Said 400 bad request. That's what it was. Silly that I forgot that. Bad request. Like, nope. Hey, sorry, this ain't happening. You already got an account, buddy. Awesome. So we now have a sign up. We're routing it through our server. And now what we need to do is go ahead and create that login. So now we need to be able to figure out a way to return that JSON web token and let our front end, our client, client side developers figure out what they're going to do with that token, and figure out how to conditionally maybe show things on a page while their users logged in. Maybe they don't want to let them make requests if they're not logged in. So let's go ahead and call this one login. And this is also going to be asynchronous. And we also want to say a request and response, because we're going to need to take a request and we're going to want to send a response. And now we can say const email and password equals rec.body. So this is that object destructuring, like I showed in one of my other videos. So destructuring, right? We have this object, and now we have access to these items in the object because we destructured it. Great. So now, same thing as above. We're going to want to probably say try and wrap that in a catch, and we can just say error. Same thing as above. And honestly, we could probably just go ahead and do this. I'm lazy, so we could copy paste that. We can come over here to this error. We can say that, and then rather than that, I mean, yeah, really, it's an internal server error, because every other instance we're going to do something different. So in this case, we're probably going to want to say const user equals await, same thing, user dot find one. And in some languages, the only bad part about this, some languages you could do this where it says find user by email, like I know Spring Data JPA, you can do that. It's kind of useful. And we could do this if statement here, this conditional, and say that, if no user was found, we can return res.status, and we can say 404 meaning not found, .json, give it a message, and say no user found with that email. Awesome. So now we're just letting them know, hey man, nope, sorry, couldn't find a user with that email. And now we need to check against bcrypt to see that our password, the user's password, we have to hash it first, because if it's saved in the database as this long chain of like goofy characters and letters because we hashed it before, now we need to rehash what they're sending us to ensure that it matches the saved hash password. So we can just kind of create this Boolean and say const is password valid, and that's going to equal await a bcrypt dot compare is one of the words that it is, and it's going to be the user's given password against the user. We already got the user dot hashed password. I'm sorry, not hash password, user dot password, because it's already hashed password. So we're going to hash it. So when we say compare, it will automatically hash it, and it'll check it against the user's password. That's great. So now we can say if password is valid, and we could say if not, so exclamation, if it is not valid, then we could say return res dot status 401 unauthorized no .json. And we don't want to let attackers really know that it's like you have the right email and stuff. You just don't got the right password. So we could just say invalid username, or sorry, invalid email in this instance, or password. That's it. So we're just letting them know, nope, nice try, dude. Doesn't work. And we get these little dots. That means that this has no effect on this type of expression. So we could just do this right here. So we don't need to use that there. No worries. And now, I think this is where I was running into an issue with mine, and the password was, turning out wrong, but it was still logging a user in. So in this edge case, this is where I decided that I was just going to wrap this in an else, because it wasn't breaking the first time, which is okay. So now, if they are going to sign in, we want to do something with this this JSON web token, and there's a couple ways to handle this. And in my personal preference, oh god, let me move this. Oh Lord, what's going on? In my personal preference, I like to send them the cookies. So that's what I'm gonna show you guys how to do. If you want to do it that way, great. If you don't, well, whatever. But I'll show you how to do cookies, and then maybe in another video I'll show you how to send it over just a JSON response. But first we need to create this token. So let's use our JSON web token library that we installed to create a token. So let's say const, this is the easy way to do it, token equals JWT, that's the name we imported it as, .sign. And remember that I told you that that MongoDB will automatically create a ID for you. Well, you wouldn't know this unless you read the docs, but the way that the ID is created and the way that they name it is that you don't see it, but it's always underscore ID. So in this instance, we want to sign it with the user that we just found, user dot, and that's going to be underscore ID, because that's how Mongo does the IDs. And why is this not liking this? Colon, secret key, super duper, oh, that's why I'm messing up, because this needs to be user ID, because when we send that like that, that's how it'll look. This is how it'll be stored under this name, because they can't store it under the name user.id, because there's no dot notation for that um, in JSON. So we could just say super duper secret. You could make this a process.env if you wanted to. Super duper secret. And then let's go ahead and break this down into an object. And we can give it a few different parameters. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but in this instance, we're just going to say expires in, and that's going to be equal to, you could do this many ways. You could say 7 days. You could say 1 day. You could say two hours, 1 hour if you only wanted to let your user stay logged in for 1 hour. And in this instance, we'll just say 1 day, because I bet you the front end guys don't want to keep logging their user in and out every hour or 30 minutes or whatever you make it. So be a good friend and make it a while. And if you want to change it for production, go ahead and do that. So now we want to look at how are we going to send this as a cookie, because I like to use cookies. Well, there's this cool thing that's built into your responses, and we can say res.cookie should pop up. Yep, response.cookie. And we can look here that there's a couple options that we can add to this. Signed, we can sign the cookie, and we're probably going to do that with our JWT. And max age, so how long is this cookie valid for? So just because your token's valid doesn't mean that your cookie is going to be valid. So we could also say that this cookie is only valid for so long. And there's also a system for refreshing the cookies. We're not going to talk about this, way more advanced. But we'll just say res.cookie. And in that res.cookie, I got to take a peek at my old stuff because I'm not going to remember that. Here, this will be the cookie name. So whatever we want to name it, my site, my cookie, we'll just call this cookie token, UUID, whatever you want to name it. I generally probably wouldn't name it token, right? We don't want to store it in there as like, hey, attackers, this is what this is a token. Like, no, don't do that. So secure, prevent XXS attacks. We'll say HTTP only, and that's going to be true. We're going to say max age, one of the parameters that told us, and that's going to be 60 by 60 by, let's say, 1,000. And that's an hour. I would have to look up how to even do that. I really don't know my cookie math that well. So secure, and we're gonna say that's true. It's gonna be a secure cookie. There we go. We just return this in response as a cookie. So now our front end developers don't have to do anything. They make this request to log this user in, and sure enough, that user will have a stored cookie that is your JSON web token. So we're telling it that this is the token that you're storing as a cookie. Here's the statistics of the cookie. It's HTTP only, it has a max age, and it's secure. So that's how we're going to send it back. And our front end developers don't have to do nothing other than just log them in and create a method to check that cookie to ensure that they're logged in. That's it. It's really, really simple. So we can say return res.json, not JSON yet, status. It did work. So it's a 200.json. And we could just say message. Oh, actually, you know what? We could even return this token inside of this. User logged. User logged in. And perfect. Now, all we really need to do is go ahead and check that this works. And I might have to loop around and double check this. I'm 99% sure, but we can see what that JSON web token looks like. And you don't remember when you create this JSON web token, you could add or take away as much. Like, let's say you want to have access to the username through the JSON web token. You 100% could do that. You could probably say username, and that could be equal to the user.username. And now all our front end developers would have to do is parse that cookie, and they would have to just retrieve that from that JSON web token. So no worries, there's tools for that. But anyways, so let's go over and to our Postman and take a look at this. Okay, so now that we're over in Postman, let's go ahead and give it a go. Obviously, this is going to be off.login because this is a different route. And for double checking sake, router.post force us login. Yeah, okay, so should work. Let's give it a go. What did we say our password was? 1, 2, 3, 4. Too easy. Let's make sure that this is a post request. We can go ahead and save this as login. Save route. Raw, remember sending this over the body, and this is how our front end developers will send this. And let's say email is Tyler, or sorry, the email. And that's going to be tyler@email.com. Awesome. And then the password, and that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. And let's check if it works. Send. Nope, there was an internal server. So something went wrong. That's okay. Let's go take a peep at our code and see what it was. Invalid status code. Let's see. Where express res.json. Oh, you know what? I was wondering if this was going to be it. I think it's because of this. Don't worry. Nodemon restart itself. And let's go ahead and just run this again. And then maybe we'll try to fix that in a second so we can see how to see the token. Yep, user was logged in. So if we look at the response, raw preview, cookies. There we go. So now we can see here that UUID, and here's the actual value of that JSON web token in the cookie. So we can see through our request, right? Set cookie, our backend told it that, hey, this is the cookie that's being set. And now we can check if the user's logged in or not. So when a user makes this request, this cookie will automatically be sent to that user's cookies, right? So, and it'll only be accessible through whatever website you guys are building. So that's great. So we are now 100% fully set up. We have a running server. We set it up to where it has a start. So when we launch this to whatever deployment site that we want to deploy this to, it knows that the start command, most of the time, especially like a Roku, will need to know that the start is at this server.js. So quick recap, what we did was we created a server.js. We imported a ton of different node modules to use throughout our website. Bcrypt Express, Bcrypt for password hashing, Express to run the server, JSON web tokens to manage whether users logged in or not, MongoDB for our database, Mongoose for the ease of access, and NodeMon to help us keep that server updating while we're making changes to our backend application. On our server, we created Express, we connected our database, we opened and put in checks for our database, started the server, told it what port we wanted. We told it that we're going to be using JSON, which allows us to use the JSON. We set this up to use middleware, which we can incorporate, and I'll show you how to use middleware in a second. We told it to use the routes coming from controller, and then we just told this application to open and listen. Let's see, we made a model for a schema for our very first MongoDB schema. This is a user table in our Mongo. We made controllers to route our application. And remember, you can do as many of these as you want. If you had different API routes, you could import, if you had multiple files in here, let's say we made it a new file, we call this api.js, which is completely silly. We'd want to create another index to round all these up and then just pull that index from here. And that way we're only using one route per file. So think about trying to keep your applications modular. Delete that. We created our MongoDB connection. And yeah, that's about it. We have a completely working Express.js server. It does not require a lot, just a couple extra tools to download and install. Yeah, that's it. I know it's a long video. I like to talk a lot. If there's anything else that you guys want to see or need help with, feel free to let me know, and I'll try to do my best to hopefully create a little bit shorter of a video. Yeah, but thanks for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed.